Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Judy Kitt. I'm the president of the Foundation for Mind Being Research, or FMBR. And for those who are new to us, I want to let you know that FMBR was founded 41 years ago by scientists, artists, and healers who are interested in exploring the nature of human consciousness through the lens of science, spirituality, and ancient wisdom traditions. I encourage you to check us out at fmbr.org, or you can check out all of our past presentations on YouTube at FMBR TV. We are honored to have Skye Nelson Isaacs with us this afternoon. Skye is an author and physics educator, building a foundation for a scientific understanding of synchronicity in our modern world. Skye has a master's degree in physics from San Francisco State University, has had careers in education, in the software industry, and in music, and has spent the last 20 years studying synchronicity, with the last 12 years publishing academic papers on it. Skye founded the Synchronicity Institute in 2017 and has published 2 books, 5 academic articles, numerous shorter pieces, and various other forms of media aiming to establish synchronicity as a tool for human advancement in the 21st century. We were talking earlier that Skye presented to FMBR in 2015 a talk entitled Perennial Wisdom as the Source of Physics, which was wonderful. And we're very excited to have him back to discuss his new book, Leap to Wholeness, How the World is Programmed to Help Us Grow, Heal, and Adapt. So Skye, welcome back. It's good to see you.
Thanks, Judy. It's great to be back in this group again. So I'll dive in, and I'm very happy to be here with you all. Thanks for joining in the middle of the day. For those of you on the West Coast of the US, if you're in a different part of the world, thank you for tuning in. I'm so grateful to be able to deliver some of this content to you, and I hope that you deliver some questions back to us. So the talk today is titled The Science and Practice of Wholeness, How the World is Programmed to Help Us Grow, Heal, and Adapt. And by the end, you'll have a sense of what I mean by this word programmed. It's very intentionally chosen. So the first section we're going to talk about today is wholeness and personal filters. And we're going to get to part 2 in a minute, or I'll show you what part 2 is in just a minute. So a little bit about me. I have an MS in physics, 7 years in high school education, some time in tech as well, in software. I founded the Synchronicity Institute to pursue this research that I'm doing and train folks on ways to experience more flow and synchronicity in their lives. And I have a number of academic papers I've published, most recently in December, one called Space-Time Paths as a Whole. And this is the culmination of a lot of the work that I presented last time in 2015 that I made progress on in the meantime. And then I have a couple of books. The most recent is called Leap to Wholeness. The previous one is Living in Flow. And basically taking the science that I think can underlie synchronicity and showing how many different ways that impacts our lives. And I'm a father and a husband and a musician and songwriter. I'm assuming about you that you are someone who is confident sometimes, uncertain sometimes, that you're caring, and that sometimes you make assumptions. And we're going to talk a lot about those assumptions today. I want to start off with the assumption that we are all caring, but we filter things in certain ways in the world that make us sometimes reactive, sometimes judgmental, sometimes combative. And our qualities of our personality are partly a result of our filters, the way that we interpret the world. So in the first part, we're going to talk about wholeness and personal filters. In the second part, we'll get to today, what is synchronicity, what is time, and what is flow. And I'm condensing 2 different talks into one, and I will leave some things out just to make it flow better. And I won't get into depth into a lot of these concepts, but I'll be able to touch on them because I'm sure different things are of interest to different people. So in the first section here, we'll talk about illustrating wholeness through the lens of science, what I mean by this word wholeness. We can all understand and identify with what wholeness is to some degree, but we need to get specific about what we mean from a scientific lens. We're going to identify personal filters, one personal filter that you have, and then understand how filters create our stories and lead to outcomes. So I came to this idea of wholeness starting from synchronicity. And synchronicity is an experience I had in my life that I saw connections between the things I was thinking about, the things I was working on, and then the opportunities that came to me in my life. And so I've spoken here about synchronicity in the past, And I'll tell an example of that in just a moment. But that leads to the experience of flow. When you're open to whatever the universe is bringing you, the experiences of life, you have more of an experience of flow. I like to say, when you align with circumstances, circumstances align with you. Synchronicity shows up, you listen to it, you get into flow. And what stops us from flow can be the filters that we have. So an opportunity comes to us and we say, no, I don't want to take that because I'm afraid. And that blocks whatever flow might be trying to emerge. And what are those filters doing? Well, they're limiting, or they're filtering wholeness, the wholeness of possibility, the wholeness of who we are. So a brief definition for now, and I'll refine this later. Synchronicity is when life happens in a way which reflects your mindset. You're thinking about something a certain way, and you get opportunities in life that reflect what you believe about that thing, how you feel about your life, or about yourself, or about this opportunity. So let me give you an example. There's a quote that I'll use later from Steve Jobs about connecting the dots. And you'll see that in a minute. But he talked about not being able to connect the dots looking forward, but always being able to look back at our lives and see how the dots all fit together. And I have a story I want to give you about synchronicity that sort of illustrates the concepts to begin with. So I was at a conference for a group of people. It was a work conference. And in the evening, we had time to go relax. So I went to the hot tub. And it was a cold winter night, and it was an outdoor conference. So the grounds were outdoors. So I'm walking through the courtyard with a towel and a bathing suit, going towards the hot tub. I haven't gotten there yet. I'm in the cold, and somebody comes back and tells me that the hot tub is broken. So I'm immediately trying to shift my brain. Like, I was anticipating being in the warm hot tub. Now I have to think about, how am I going to get warm? I'm disappointed that I don't get to have this fun experience. Okay, I shift gears. I'm thinking I'm going to go back in my room, get on some warm clothes, climb in bed, and have some time to read my book. And reading my book is nice because I have a young daughter at home, so I don't have a lot of time to read quietly to myself. So I'm thinking, okay, this is good too. But before I can do that, I hear a voice from across the courtyard that says, hey, why don't you come join our group? We've got socializing time right now, and you'd be more than welcome. And I've never met this person. I can't even really see them. I don't understand why they'd be inviting me, but it comes so out of the blue to me that I see it in sort of a different context. I see it as a synchronicity. Like, maybe there's something here that's useful. And I think to myself, well, what are my real goals right now? And yes, it's nice to go sit in my room and read, but I also have a goal at this time in my life of having more exposure to people, meeting new people, networking, getting chances to speak like I'm doing today. And so I have to shift my gears again, right? I'm shifting the filter that I'm looking through. I'm saying, okay, maybe this is something useful to do. I go back into my room, I change my clothes, and I come out and I say yes to this person. So I go into their group and I'm socializing with them for the evening. We're having a really nice time, meeting some nice people. And at the end of the night, I meet someone named Michael. And Michael has a background in physics, so we get to talking. And we have a really nice connection. So at the end of the night, we exchange numbers. He says he's part of this group and they might want me to come speak at some point. So I think that's great. This is why I came here, right? I got in the flow. I was definitely feeling like this is where I was meant to be. So I go home, and 2 months later, I get an email out of the blue from my friend Janet. Janet's with the National Speakers Association. That's how I know her. And she says, we have an opening this weekend for a speaker, and we'd love to have you come give your talk. My friend Michael, who's also on the board, suggested your name. And I said, how do you know Sky? And so immediately we knew we wanted to call you up. So I had a great time with them. That talk was a great experience. And it all came because of this broken hot tub that redirected me away from the hot tub and then directed me into this meeting where I met a new person and expanded my network. So inherent in here are these elements of disruption, having obstacles come in our way that turn us around or turn us away from what we thought was going to happen. But they do so in a way that somehow reflects our mindset, reflects what it is we're trying to accomplish in life, or reflects what it is we might be needing to learn at that moment. We can't always see what it is we're needing to learn. So sometimes we have to take some time to figure out what's the context here that this is happening within. But my belief or my experience is that synchronicity always happens within a greater context. It's helping expand our context. It turns out, by the way, that the hot tub wasn't actually broken. We found out the next day that they just forgot to take down the sign. So there was really a conspiracy to get me to go meet these people. So I want to switch into wholeness, and I want you to tune into what it feels like to be in wholeness. For me, when I got redirected away from the hot tub and into a meeting with people I'd never met, talking about things that were interesting to me, there was a sense of wholeness because I felt like I didn't have a plan, but I was right where I needed to be. So I want you to tune in, and if you want to close your eyes, you can. Remember a time that you felt so in the zone that you knew with every part of you that you were doing something great. I would imagine your inner critic was silent. Imagine that feeling. It could just be cooking dinner, sewing clothes, folding laundry. Could be having a great conversation with a friend or your kids, parents, taking a walk in nature. And think of this as wholeness. One aspect of wholeness, having access to all of who you are without barriers, without resistances. So feel free to open your eyes when you're ready and take that with you through this talk. And you'll see I'll talk about wholeness in a number of different ways, all of which are pointing towards something bigger that we can't actually grasp as a whole. It's kind of like the elephant, the elephant that you can't actually see because you have to just use your hands to feel it. And if you're feeling the legs, then you might think it's like a tree trunk. If you're feeling the trunk, you might think it's like a snake. If you're feeling the tusk, you might think it's like a spear or a fan or a wall or a rope. Depending on what you feel, on what you take in, depending on your filter, you're going to think it's something different. And the idea here is that you cannot perceive the whole, only the parts. And it becomes necessary to rely on other perspectives to be able to get a sense of the whole. So what is wholeness? I'm going to suggest wholeness is a kind of thing where you perceive a part, but there is a hidden whole. There's something that you can't see that is giving rise to what you can see. And so perceiving the whole requires multiple points of view. We can't ever directly perceive the whole in this idea because it's giving rise to the parts, but it's not equivalent to the parts. I'll remind you of Plato's cave analogy, where things in the physical world that we see and experience are like the projection of a shadow onto the wall of a cave. We know that there's something else there. We know that there's a bird behind our head that we can't see that's giving rise to this shadow and giving rise to a single perspective on the object. But we can't just turn around and look because there's a wall in the way. There's a veil that we can't see through. So our filters are what give us the projections, give us what we see, the limited view that we have. But the wholeness that's actually giving rise to that projection is what we're trying to get a grasp on today. So filters make it hard to see that whole picture. Think of a time when you felt, instead of wholeness, when you felt tension about a situation or a relationship. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're at work and somebody comes up to you, wants to talk to you about a project that you're doing together with the team in the coming months. And they tell you something you already know. Like they start to list out, okay, so I wanted you to know the agenda of the timeline is by the end of April, we're going to finish part 1. By the end of May, we're going to finish part 2. But you actually know all this information and they don't realize it. Like you were in the same meeting and you feel like they're talking with kind of a step up on you. And so the immediate filter might be like, I want to tell them that I already know this. I want to tell them that I'm important and I was in that meeting too. I want to show what I know. So that would be a dilemma or a tension in a relationship. But it's a dilemma because you're not really sure if you should speak up or not. And I'm going to suggest that this kind of thing is a filter. It's a challenge where we're not sure exactly how to respond, because if we do respond a certain way, we might get perceived as argumentative. Or if we don't respond, we might be perceived as not knowing as much as somebody else. So there's a dilemma in the way that we think other people might perceive us or how we think that things will go. So our filters are what limit what we can see and hear. We can only see and hear things that make sense to us, things that fit our worldview. And they give rise to our stories. So if this person comes to me with a statement about a timeline that I already know about for the company, it might give me a story that nobody ever hears me or sees me or thinks that I'm part of the team. People forget about me, and that might be my story. Or I might have the story when I was in the hot tub, going to the hot tub, that I don't need to go and be with people I don't know. What good is that going to give me? That's a filter. I don't want to go do that thing, because it gives rise to a story that I don't need to go be with these people. And that leads to actions. So our actions come from our stories, the stories we tell ourselves. And what's important about actions is that actions tell a story themselves. And actions tell a story to the world about what we care about, what we feel and believe. And I suggest that those actions lead to synchronicities. So when I told the story to myself, when I shifted the story to saying, yes, I want to go meet new people, it led to an action of doing that, which led to a synchronicity later on down the line, where I got an opportunity to do something cool. So filters are connected to wholeness. They filter the wholeness. They filter the possibilities. They filter who we are. They limit us from being all the things we could be or feel to feeling a specific thing. When I feel defensive or combative, it puts everything in that lens. Makes me feel like everybody's out to get me, maybe. In the case of the person coming to me with information, it puts me at odds with them. But I want to suggest some of the evidence that we have for wholeness in the world, and starting with our brain. So the brain is designed, probably a lot of folks here know more than me about how the brain works, but it's designed, it seems to be based on the Fourier transform and holographic functioning in some way, which is related to what I'll be talking about today. But to show this, I want you to sit straight for a moment and put your hands like where you can see them, but you're not looking directly at them. So they can be just resting on your laptop in front of you. And out of the peripheral vision, you see your hands. But your peripheral vision doesn't see things all that crisply. It sees kind of a mash of color, if you're like me. It just sort of sees the shape of your hands, but not the specifics. Now on the count of 3, I want you to just move your middle finger. 1, 2, 3. And if you really pay attention, when you move your finger, you'll notice you can see it more clearly. You can pick out of the surroundings that motion really easily. So the idea is that your brain is made to see patterns. It's made to see changes in patterns. It's made to see motion. And it's obviously an evolutionary advantage because you can see predators in the wild, or you can see your prey if you're hunting in the wild. If they move, you jump on it. So we've been adapted to see motion, and I'm going to show you why that is. When your finger wiggles, it's easier to see, and there's a payoff to that in the jungle, seeing things that move. Your brain sees patterns as a whole. When your finger moves, all the relationships change. So the relationship between my finger and the other fingers changes when I move it. The relationship between my finger and the computer screen in front of me changes. So what we're looking at here is the nature of the whole scene, not just the thing I'm moving, but how it's related to the whole scene. Another example of how our perceptions can trick us is this famous meme that went around about the dress. You might have seen this before, and if you haven't, it's a picture of a dress that got passed around the internet because people disagreed on what colors it was. And for instance, I see a dress that I perceive to be white and gold, but other people might see this and perceive it to be blue and black. Now, it's clearly got certain colors to begin with on the screen, but our brain infers what it thinks is really going on. It turns out that the explanation, or one of the explanations for this, is that if you assume this dress is being viewed in daylight, then you see it as being in shadow. So your assumption about the surroundings is it's outside, but then the dress must be in shadow. And so you subtract the shadow color in your mind. You say it's darker than it should be because of the shadow. I'm going to assume it's a white dress. But if you're someone who is thinking that this is a picture taken indoors under artificial lighting, you're not assuming there's a shadow, you're assuming there's a brighter kind of yellow light, then your brain's going to subtract off the yellow. And when it subtracts yellow, it's going to perceive the dress as being actually darker than you see it. So your brain is making these adjustments, And you end up having a perception of the dress that actually is based on your assumption about the surroundings. So our filters, we don't even necessarily notice that we're making that assumption. Now, I can't just go back and forth between seeing one color and the other in that dress image, but different people have different perceptions of it. And for a while, they were really arguing, like, can't you see it? Can't you see it? Can't you see it? Until there was some explanation from neuroscientists as to why that might be. So again, come back to this question, what is wholeness? I'm going to ask this question. What's common between a photograph, a hologram, and a person? Again, my answer is we perceive a part, but there is a hidden whole. We perceive a part, but which is one perspective on a hidden whole. So we're going to start with the photograph. Wholeness in a photograph. And again, we're talking about taking in the whole scene at once. So you look at this picture and you see individual buildings, but you also realize they're part of a big scene of the city. But in actuality, they are a bunch of pixels on the screen that are part of a whole pattern. We're going to start looking at the world as that, as a bunch of pixels in the world that are part of a whole pattern, not just individual entities. So think about the notion of the map and the territory. The territory is the thing that you see. The map here is the Fourier transform of that territory. This is the mathematics that I was suggesting goes along with the brain in some cases. It's the mathematics that goes into how Adobe Photoshop works, and it makes changes to photographs mathematically. It's also the mathematics that goes behind music and audio processing and video processing. So the map works in the following way. It places a dot on the screen to represent a pattern, and the pattern gets placed on the territory. Let me give you an example of that. So here's a dot I could place sort of up left and bottom right in the map. And that map encodes or corresponds to the pattern you see on the left. A bunch of wavy lines going at a certain angle. And those lines could be farther apart. They could be brighter or darker. They could be at different angles. And if I do enough of those different lines in different ways, with just the right combination, I start to see an image emerge. So now I can start to see more complex patterns emerge. I'm just adding thousands and thousands of patterns that are similar in nature, but different in actual shape. And you see here, it starts to get like a weave. And now you can start to see the magic. With enough data, you start to see the buildings emerge. So these lines, which seem like random pieces of basic simple patterns, are actually encoded or encoding the image that you see of the city. And so what I'm getting at here is shown in this video. You can create the city image from pixels, as you usually might, like on your computer. That's how you think of a photograph or a picture on your computer is made of pixels. You can do that, but you can, and that's breaking it down into the smallest pieces, which are all separate from each other. This is the reductionist model. I can break everything down into pieces that are separate. When I put them together, I get the picture of the city. The blue goes in the sky, the black goes on the building. But there's another way to break down the image. There's another way to decompose the image, and that is in terms of patterns that we saw. And I'm going to go through that again so you can see. I'm just adding patterns, thousands by thousands by thousands in the right combination. And out of that, eventually, patterns or images that don't look at all like the patterns start to emerge. And the key is that they don't look at all like the patterns that are making them up. So if I wanted to change one of these buildings, imagine one of these buildings as a part of you that you're feeling tension about, this thing that we talked about earlier. Some part of you that you want to change, or some part of your life that you want to change. If you wanted to change that one part of your life, you'd have to create a pattern. You have to modify patterns that extend across the whole scene. So the patterns that create this image extend across the whole scene. And that's really the key idea of wholeness. To create the building, you need patterns that exist everywhere. So you're not actually just changing the thing you think you're changing. You're also changing other aspects of the world and of your life. And you've seen this in your own life when you make a change personally, it reflects in lots of ways. I know as I've become maybe more patient with my daughter as a parent, I've also seen myself become more patient with me and become more patient at work and with my spouse and with my parents. And that quality is not actually just me and my daughter. It's something that happens in me, in the wholeness of who I am. And then it expresses itself in all these different ways. And in the same way, these patterns that make up the picture are patterns that extend across the whole scene, but they express themselves as a building here, and as a building there, and as a road down here. And I can make changes to the map that are very precise, but I can affect the whole territory. Let me show you what I mean. If I put a filter around the outside of the map, what happened to the territory? It got blurry around the edges. And I've removed the high frequency information from the map. All the stuff around the edges corresponds to quickly varying colors. And so at the edges, you've got quick changes in what color is there, and those edges get blurred everywhere. And the key is that it gets blurred everywhere, not just one building, but every single portion of the screen gets the effect of this change. And I can make another filter which even blurs it out even more by just cutting out more of the frequencies. So this is just keeping the very lowest frequencies right in the middle. And those low frequencies correspond to the very broad colors, very broad shading. It's like what you see when you first open your eyes in the morning. So wholeness is a very fundamental part of signal processing and data analysis and the physical world. I would say mindset is a map which affects the whole territory. When we change our mindset, everything shifts around it. And I'll just jump for a second here to my research. The research I've recently published is taking these ideas and showing that quantum mechanics itself, the mathematical and physical theory, can be formulated in terms of the equations of holograms and light. And so there's a sense in which the image we just saw is reflecting the way that particles actually seem to work and their sort of existential nature. And so there's a way in which it does seem to be that the physical world is behaving like a hologram in a very specific way. We'll come to a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So to think more about wholeness, we're going to stay focused on wholeness and filters. Wholeness is like white light and filters are like single colors. So the filters in you make it hard to see sometimes, hard to see certain things. So for me, like sometimes it's hard to see when someone appreciates me. Someone can give me a compliment and I might say to myself, oh, that's nice of them, but they're really just trying to make me feel good. Or, well, they don't really know my field. So yeah, they think I did a good job, but they don't really know. You know, it's hard to see because I've got some other story playing in my head that's telling me something different and invalidating something that they're saying. Sometimes it can be hard to, like our feelings are also filters. So I feel nervous about how things are going to go all the time. And so I might have a hard time feeling optimistic. Just generally speaking, it doesn't actually matter what the situation is. That's the filter I see things through. On the other hand, I might be someone who just wants to always feel positive and uplifted because it's hard for me to, deal with other types of emotions. And so I don't like feeling constrained. And so I see everything through the lens of possibility. And I'm like that sometimes. Everything's through the lens of possibility. And it's hard to see when there's an actual limitation. So our feelings and our thoughts both create perceptive filters that make it hard to see what's really happening around us. And we have many useful filters. Compassion, joy, excitement are all filters. But anger and disappointment are filters too. We call them positive and negative. I wouldn't necessarily use those words. The ideal is that we can move between them. And that would be an experience of flow. We can move from one to the other. If someone does something which makes me upset at work or at home, then I can go from being angry to then moving to being disappointed. Like, okay, I wish it had been different. And then from disappointment, I might be able to forgive something or feel compassion. And then I can move from compassion to maybe excitement or expectation about what else can come next. So there's a process that we can go through of moving between the filters that we see the world through. And that movement is healthy experience. And I would call that flow. And it's fulfilling in itself. We don't want to get rid of the feeling of anger or the feeling, or we don't want to always experience the feeling of joy. We want to be able to move between them. What fear does, in my experience, is it's also a filter, but it's sort of a unique filter in that it stops us from moving. So what I mean by fear is something that it comes up all the time in all sorts of ways. Fear of having a conversation with somebody, fear of self-promoting, fear of how you might be perceived, fear of being social. I mean, it's a resistance to what we think is going to happen to us, and that comes up sort of all the time. And the inner critic is an example of this. So you can think about, when have you experienced your inner critic filter lately? Might have even been since this call started. For me, the inner critic is coming up and saying something all the time, and I have to sort of have a dialogue with it and say, okay, I'm not going to be listening to that fear right now. But fear is just something that shows up in our life on a regular basis, if you're like me, and it's a filter which keeps us stuck. So the idea is that when we tame our fear, we don't get rid of our problems. We just are able to feel what's underneath the fear. So if the fear is a fear of something going wrong, taming our fear doesn't mean getting rid of the fact that something might go wrong. It means being able to feel, instead of fear, feel disappointment, or feel motivation, or feel compassion for ourselves for not being able to meet a goal. Doesn't mean that everything goes right all the time. It means that we're able to move again between the different experiences, between the different filters. So I like to think I'm not fearless, but I can move within fear. I think this is a realistic way to think about our filters and how we embrace our filters. We just don't want to get stuck in them. So by filters, I think there's sort of two different kinds. There's input filters, what we're able to perceive. We've talked about this, the way we limit what we can make sense of in the world. And there's also output filters. Whether we think it's okay to speak up in a meeting is related to whether we think we're going to hurt somebody's feelings or be made fun of. And so we might limit how we express ourselves based upon our filters, our feelings, and our thoughts. So again, coming back to this question, what's common between a photograph, a hologram, and a person? We perceive a part, which is one perspective on a hidden whole. We saw that in the case of a human with filters. The filters project or perceive a part of the thing, but there's a hidden whole underneath that when we move between the filters, we get to the whole. We get to see different parts of the whole. And finally, I'm going to talk about the hologram example. So the picture on the left is just a photograph. It's like on an iPad. If you tilt it, it just looks like a photograph. It sort of skews one way than the other. So nothing special. On the right, we have a hologram, and you'll see that it's different. And I saw holograms for the first time in college, and we got to build one, and it just blew my mind. There's something so amazing and magical about it. And so I've been thinking about it and studying the underlying nature of them for all this time. And you'll see that the buildings are all moving past each other, but they're not really there. So it looks like there's all these objects there, but they're not. It's just a piece of film with light being tricked. But when you put it down like this and you look at it, it has perspective and relief. So every building basically takes its position in relative to the other buildings. And so that's the key notion, is that the hologram captures the relationships between the buildings, not just one relationship, like one vantage point, like the photograph does, but all possible relationships. And it does this by capturing the light directly from a model of the city, for instance. And it doesn't filter it with a lens. It just captures it as it is, so that when you see it, depending on your angle of view, you will see it in different ways. So start by looking at the center picture here. If I'm looking straight at the city, I can align the star with the circle. The star is marking a building in the foreground, and the circle is marking a light source in the back. And so when you move to the left picture, what you've done is you've tilted the image to the right, or you've shifted yourself to the left. And so you've moved the foreground to the right pretty far and the background to the left. And that gives it a sense of three-dimensionality. The film is still there in the same way that it was, but the apparent buildings on it have moved. What I've tried to do with the star is to show you that the star has moved on the film. It's no longer in the center. Now, if you switch over to the right-hand side, you can even see this in more relief. The buildings in the front move to the left, and the circle in the back moves to the right. And so the star has moved across the film, depending on your perspective. So what makes a hologram special is that you've got two things. You've got the film itself, where you can describe the location of the film, and you've got the buildings that appear in it, which move relative to the film. That doesn't happen in a photograph. In a photograph, the thing you see stays right where it is on the film. So this makes it quite an incredible phenomenon. And it gives you the sense that each perspective is a unique story based on the same whole. The film captures a whole, all the possible relationships of that city, of those buildings. And when we change our perspective on it, we get a unique story of that whole. But we can't see the whole, every possible perspective at once. They're present in the film, but we can't perceive them. We have to perceive them one at a time. And that's exactly what I mean by this statement that we perceive a part. I lost it. We perceive a part, which is one perspective on a hidden whole. We perceive one view of the buildings on the hologram, which is just one part of all the information that's present in that hologram. So we've seen three examples of a photograph, a hologram, and us as people. I want to leave you in this first section with this question, a replacement for this question. This question is, how do we get something from nothing? And I think this is endemic to our culture, at least in the West. We think that, the Big Bang is how the world was created out of the void. And we start from nothing and we get something. But I think this philosophy also trickles into other parts of our lives. Like if I don't get up in the morning and have a long list of things to do, maybe I'm not valuable, not valued. Or if I don't have enough money, or if I don't have the latest generation of telephone in my pocket, what am I worth? Am I going to be able to keep my life going? We have this sense that we have to keep filling things up. And that's because we think about the world as being nothing in the absence of doing something. Well, what about this other question? How do we get something from everything? How do we look at the world like a garden that already exists? It's full of these possibilities, what you might call the multiverse of possibilities. And you can go to the trees and sit in the forested area. You can sit on the bench in the middle. You can walk down to the fountain. You could go pick some weeds and think about what a weed is. A weed is a part of the garden that's just growing on its own. And you've called it a weed and pulled it out because it's just a part of the garden that's growing that you don't want to keep. So our filters are the ways in which we're pulling out certain weeds. And we can only see what we leave behind, what we don't pull out. But what's amazing about a garden is it's growing all the time, even without us. So instead of thinking about the world as something we have to create all the time, we naturally are creating in the world. It's naturally growing. Our question is really about how do we perceive things? What do we nurture? What do we weed out and what do we keep? Another way to frame this is thinking about always carving away. Rather than adding to nothing, you're carving away from wholeness. Think about a rainbow. A rainbow is a place in the sky where white light has been spread by the prism of the rain into red, orange, yellow, blue, all those. But it's white light that no longer has the other colors. So it's beautiful because of what's not there. When you see red in a rainbow, it's because you started with white light and you subtracted the blue. If you see blue in a rainbow, it's because you started with white light and you subtracted the red. What you don't realize is that there's actually white light everywhere, and there's light that's been removed where the rainbow is. So you've removed certain colors of light to reveal a rainbow that was already sort of there. This is a really important shift. We think of the rainbow as being like shining in the sky, like it's added to the sky. But in fact, it's a result of pulling away and filtering out certain colors so that what's left is a rainbow. And you can think about this in your own experience of yourself. What can you remove to reveal a solution? And this is why I think synchronicity is a useful concept, because synchronicity and what it leads to, flow, are what occur when we start removing our barriers of thinking, of filtering. We start removing the ways in which we say no to certain experiences that could be useful to us. And solutions start to emerge. When we have filters of combativeness or defensiveness or worry about the future, we can sometimes take actions which get in the way of actually solving problems in the flow manner. We might solve them in one moment, but they create new problems down the road. And flow is this experience of being able to reveal solutions which actually resolve and don't create further downstream effects. That's my experience of flow. So I want to look at how we're doing on time. It's 12:40. Are there any questions so far? I want to invite folks to speak up with questions and make sure everyone's on the same page as we go so that there's no people getting lost.
I have a question. I wanted to know how we, or do you have a practice to actually find your own filters? It's sort of a self-inquiry practice. How do you identify?
Here we are.
Right.
Name your filter. So this is what we'll do. That's a great question. I've developed this exercise to highlight, how can we identify what is the filter we're looking at the world through? And think of filters like your glasses. They're a lens that are shaping what you see. Your glasses are beneficial because they help you conform what you see to being more accurate. But sometimes our filters make things maybe less accurate. So the benefit of naming your filter is that it helps you see what other choices you might have. So just naming it, that's all we're going to do here. Some examples of a name would be, I have to show what I know. We talked about this earlier with the person who's, someone's coming to them, telling them a bunch of information they already know, kind of as a know-it-all. And you feel like, oh, I have to stand up and show what I know. But it leads to a dilemma. Or I have to push back. Maybe you work in an environment where people are constantly making suggestions and you feel like you have to push back. That's just an automatic reaction. I do see a question. I'm open to taking that. Do you want to read it to me, Judy?
Yes. Why do you associate synchronicity with ourselves and not something outside of ourselves, like higher knowledge or a higher power?
I don't think I separate those two things. I don't mean to imply that it's only us that's creating synchronicity. I think that for me, there's this alignment between the higher power and ourselves. So I don't think of those as separate. And I will talk about synchronicity more in the second part of the talk. So maybe let's make sure that question gets answered by the time we're done.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that up. So when have you recently felt tension? And you probably thought about this earlier, a relationship where you feel some tension. And identify, has this happened before? So probably when you feel some kind of tension in life, like the person's talking at me and telling me something I already know, it's creating tension because it's happened before. Maybe this happens in my marriage, and maybe it happens with my parents. I got used to being told what to do even when I already knew. And so it's a familiar feeling. So you identify a familiar feeling. And then ask yourself, what are you thinking about? What are the thoughts? Maybe the thought is, if I don't speak up, they're going to misinterpret me. They're going to misunderstand me. And then you ask yourself, what are the emotions you're feeling? So if I'm misunderstood, I might feel scared that someone will not take me into consideration. And just some examples of emotions that you could use are here. So you're identifying your thoughts and your feelings and also your physical sensations. Like when this person says something to me that I already know, I feel this tension in my chest, and a feeling of butterflies in my stomach. Like, oh my God, I have to speak up, but I don't know how, and I feel nervous about it. What if I get a bad response? Those are the thoughts and the feelings, and the feeling is the tension in the chest, the sensation. And so from your thoughts and feelings and sensations, you can name your filter. And feel free to take a screenshot of this. We didn't go slowly enough to have people really do this, but take a screenshot and walk through this yourself. And the name of the filter is not going to be graded. It's like something that's helpful to you. So just a reminder, I have to show what I know. Oh yeah, that reminds me that I have this feeling that I have to show what I know, which goes along with the feeling of I'm going to be overlooked or misunderstood. And it just reminds me of those feelings and sensations. And then the benefit here is that there are alternate filters. Once I've identified a filter, I can have different versions of it, which allow me to see other possibilities. So one different version is I don't have to show what I know. Just by identifying that I feel this way allows me to say, well, maybe I don't need to do that. Or I could say, maybe I don't have to show what I know to marry. Maybe I can, speak to somebody else about this, but I don't have to say it to this person right now. And it gives me some options. Or I can show what I know later. Maybe there's a better time when I'll get what I need, but I won't be interrupting the problem right now. Or maybe I don't have to know. Maybe the assumption is that I have to know and I have to show what I know. But I can get underneath all of that by realizing that it's okay for me not to know. So these are ways that the wording itself can just help you see all the different ways that you're thinking about it and give you options. And so when you notice a filter, and sometimes the best way is through your body, those felt sensations, some kind of tension that you identified, or some kind of feeling of distress, ask yourself, what just happened? What triggered it? Was it a conversation with somebody? Was it an email you just read? And if you're paying attention, you'll probably notice a filter every 10 or 20 minutes. You'll have a different experience with some other person and it will trigger a feeling. And each of those feelings are part of a filter, a way that you perceive the world. So ask yourself what just happened. Ask yourself, what other filters could I choose? If it's an unpleasant experience, then maybe there are some other filters you could choose if you identify what it is you're feeling. And what words can you replace, like we did, to make the filter different? So does that answer your question, Judy?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful. And it's nice to be able to spend time to go through that. So I do hope that folks were able to either do it quickly or take a screenshot and try it on your own. I find it really useful. Mm-hmm. So our filters are these things that make it hard to see or hear certain things. They limit what we can see and hear and understand. They lead us to the stories we tell ourselves about the world. And the stories lead to actions, which we take. And those actions lead to the stories that the world perceives of us. And synchronicities emerge into our lives, which come from that. So again, synchronicity is when life happens in a way which reflects your mindset. So I want to jump into synchronicity here. And I like the question that came up, so we can really get to that now. Can I continue here, Judy, or is there anything we need to take care of?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So part 2, what is synchronicity? What is time? What is flow? So Steve Jobs was famous for this beautiful quote: you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. And he was referring to his own experience in classes at Reed College, quitting classes and sitting on the lawn and talking to people, and then taking a calligraphy class, which wasn't on his agenda originally, and then dropping out of school and eventually founding Apple Computer, and how all those experiences informed his development of the Apple and the business. And you can see how it all made sense in retrospect, but in the future, in the present, he couldn't see how the future was going to unfold. And I'm going to suggest that one of the things you can use to start to see how the dots are going to connect in the future is synchronicity. You can start to see the context that events are happening within and get a sense for what might happen next. It's not something you can use to predict the world, but you can come to expect synchronicity. So let's talk about what synchronicity is. A synchronicity is a seemingly random event that leads to an experience you're seeking to have. So I'm not saying whether it's conscious or not that you're seeking to have this experience, but the idea is that it's a random event which leads to an experience you're seeking to have. Or at least, and this is just my definition, this isn't the only definition. You could have a lot of variations, and Carl Jung's original definition is different from this. This is a definition which helps me analyze it a little bit from a scientific lens, but it's not meant to be exclusive. So we're going to look at synchronicities, which are seemingly random events that lead to experiences you're seeking to have. It could be experiences you're not intending to have, but they happen maybe for some beneficial purpose that you can't see in the present. So I want to tell you about a really, really, really big synchronicity that I had. Not the normal kind, but this was a bigger one. I was on a trip traveling alone as a student, trying to meet, I had another friend named Dana who was in Israel traveling. So I was in Europe She was in Israel. And we had been good friends for a bunch of years in high school and then fallen out of touch in college. And we just had this vague plan to meet in Greece because Greece was kind of geographically central. And we were both excited about it, but we didn't have much of a plan. And when I was in Spain, in the town of Sevilla, I called her on a phone and we talked for 5 minutes. And when I was at a payphone and I realized after 5 minutes had gone by, I'd spent like $30. So I panicked because that was like my money for the week. And I hung up the phone. I said, I'll call you when I get close to Greece. And I hung up the phone. So I'm traveling through Italy a couple of weeks later, and I'm on my way getting closer to Greece, and I end up getting sick. So I have to turn around and head back to my airline city, which was Paris. I had a ticket booked out of there anyway. I just had to change the date, and I was really disappointed, but I figured I'd call Dana when I got back to the US. So I get on a train to go to Paris, and I have 48 hours before I have to leave, so I might as well have some fun. And I was well enough to go to the museum. So I went to the Louvre Museum, and I'm walking through the Louvre Museum about mid-afternoon. I'm going to find the Mona Lisa, and I stop in my tracks because there's this person there that looks just like Dana. And I'm so confused because it's not Dana, obviously. Dana's in Israel, but I can't take my eyes off her because it looks just like her. So finally, her friend notices me and says to her, "Don't look now, but there's this really weird guy staring at you." So luckily she did turn around and she saw me and she said, "That's Sky." So we met up against all odds in Paris when we were trying to meet in Greece and had no way to communicate. And I was 24 hours from leaving for home. How is that possible? Well, she was back in Israel and got an invitation from her friends to go to Paris for the weekend because of Fashion Week. And it's not that far of a trip, to take from Israel to Paris, not like it is from where I am in California. So it was kind of a spontaneous adventure for them. Initially, she said, "No, I can't go because I have to wait for Sky to call." We didn't have cell phones. So it's like, if I miss his call, I'm never going to hear from him again. So she had to decide between waiting for me to call and going to Paris with her friends. And finally, she gets on the phone with her mom that night. And her mom says, "Honey, forget about Sky. Just go to Paris. Have fun." And how lucky that she did, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't have met. So I'm going to talk in a minute about how that might be able to make sense to us in a logical world, not just be some mystical idea of how we come together. But the question that it brings up in my mind is, how do I proceed when I'm unsure? If I'm not sure, I want to go on this trip to Paris, but I'm waiting for someone to call and I'm afraid to lose that opportunity. How do I make that choice? And the idea is that we live in a responsive cosmos. Synchronicity is a response of the world around us to the choices that we're making. Whether you think of it as the thoughts we're having or the emotions we're having or the intuition that we have, those can all be possible. I'm thinking of it as a response mostly to our actions, to what we do with those thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So I'm going to talk about this responsive cosmos in 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about touch points. These are the times that you get information about the world, the interactions you have, conversations, the information in an email is a touch point. And in between touch points, there is possibility. So when I called Dana from Sevilla, Spain, that was a touch point because I knew where she was. She was picking up the phone in Israel and she knew where I was. I was on the phone in Sevilla. So we knew stuff about each other. And then there wasn't another touch point until we accidentally met in Paris. That's the next touch point. And in between those touch points, there's possibility. There's all the ways that things could go. And clearly for her, that meant some pretty amazing things like going to Paris. And your environment adapts and responds in between those touch points. I had no way to know that Dana would end up going to Paris. That was a way in which my environment adapted and responded to the situation. And so what can we do when we're unsure? Well, I suggest we can keep building momentum. We can't control the outcomes, but we can take actions which align with the outcome that we want to experience. Take actions which have a certain intention. And I call that building momentum. So think about the model in this way. We have a floor plan of the Louvre Museum. And on the left is my line. I'm the blue person, and she's the red person. At the bottom image there is a picture of the Venus de Milo, a famous statue. At the top is the Mona Lisa that I was trying to find. And in the middle is a painting called Paris and Helen. It turns out Paris and Helen was where Dana was standing when I saw her in the Louvre. So how did that happen? And if I had chosen something different, could it have been a different experience? Is it possible I could have missed her? And by the way, this is not just any one person. We're not married. So this became a very important relationship in my life. And we have a daughter. And so all of that is a result of this meeting. Is it possible that we could have missed that meeting and had a different life? Well, I'm suggesting that because we live in a responsive cosmos, it's adapting to us. And so, no, we're not going to miss it because there are multiple possible ways it can unfold. So here, the basic idea I want you to have in your head is that there's two different ways that she could experience the situation. She could go to the Venus de Milo, or she could go to the other hallway to Paris and Helen. And before I meet her, both of those are possible. And so it's only when I do make a choice and I go to the right, I meet her at the Venus de Milo and I say, oh my God, there's Dana. And the other branch you notice disappeared. From my point of view, it was immaterial. It was just information. It's just part of the multiverse of possibilities. And only when I see her does it become real. I actually think I probably told this story when I was last here, so people might remember it. And this model is, improved a bit, but it's the same story here. If I go down the other hallway, there's the possibility that the other branch becomes true. So because both branches are possible to begin with, then I can make either choice and still get the outcome that I'm after. Of course, I don't know that that's what's going to happen. I'm not consciously after it, but it does align with what I'm thinking about, wishing we could have met. So what's the takeaway here for me? I had the sense that I was able to, our plans had to be abandoned. So we were disappointed, yet we found a way to meet. We did what we each needed to do to be whole. So how do we make choices when we're unsure? Well, we start with wholeness. We start with what's going to really, I let go of the filter of what I'm afraid is going to happen, what I'm afraid of losing, and then focus on what's the next step that I can take forward to lead a life that I want to lead, to be the person I want to be. And that's what I mean by wholeness here. Get underneath the filters to what really turns you on, what's really right for you or for the people that you're trying to serve right now. And let go of the fearful filters, let go of the ways in which we're worried it's not going to work, and sort of begin to open up the possibilities that you can't even control. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip this other story of synchronicity, but I want to give you a little sense that why synchronicity is important. Synchronicity provides context for our events. It gives us a sense of, that our event is not happening in a vacuum. When I decided to go to, when I met Paris by accident, when I met Dana by accident in Paris, it was part of a bigger picture in which we had been trying to meet. And it gave me a sense of the importance of our relationship. It helped me really lock into, how valuable that relationship was for me. So it provides context. It helps see beyond filters and get over attachments. So if someone comes to me at work and makes a suggestion for a way I could handle a problem, it might not be apparent to me that that's a good suggestion. And I might think, no, that's a bad suggestion. I'm not going to do that. And then a couple of days later, I get new information and I realize, oh, that's a really good idea. And so information can come from other people or from other situations that help us see beyond our filters and get over attachments, get over the way we thought things were going to go. So synchronicity is really valuable in almost every context, because when we can get over our attachments and see beyond our filters, we can get more into flow and be in more harmony with the people and the situations we're in. So what does synchronicity really mean? Well, syn means together, chronos is clock-oriented time, and icity is a quality or condition. So synchronicity is a falling together in time. I think this is originally from Carl Jung and his definition. This is why he named the word what he named it. Just for if anybody's curious, serendipity is a similar word. Serendipity, I think, has connotations of being a positive event. A synchronicity here doesn't illustrate positivity. It's a falling together, a meaningfulness in time. So Dana's meeting with me was meaningful because it happened we were in the same room at the same time. If we had even missed each other by 10 minutes, it wouldn't have been a synchronicity. We wouldn't have met. And you can imagine situations where, it's really meaningful that things happen at the same time, but otherwise it's just meaningless. It's not worth tracking. So synchronicity has to do with alignment in time. Not necessarily positive. Murphy's Law, I think, is another name for synchronicities that happen, which are not so positive. There are different notions of time, and now we're going to get into my research on time that's been published in the journal Quantum Reports. One of the things I learned about is after doing the research is some other notions of time from other cultures. So, for instance, the Aboriginals think of time as eternal. It's like we're all living in a dream called the dreaming, and we're experiencing the past continuously in the present. And the idea of a spiral time or circular time or repeating cyclical time is aligned with the way the Aboriginals view time. The Greeks saw time as different as well. They have the notion of chronos, which is like looking at the clock. They also have the notion of kairos, which is like opportune moments. So the opportune moment when I was in the Louvre to see Dana, that was a kairos moment. There was a sense, a feeling that imbued that whole experience, which was one whole moment. We weren't like thinking, oh, this meeting we've had at the Louvre has been over an hour and a half. I'm time to move on to something else. We were immersed in this moment, this feeling. So think of kairos as the qualitative nature of your experience. You know, this whole call, this hour and a half that we're together is like one moment, whether it's an hour and a half or an hour and 35 minutes or an hour and 25 minutes, that doesn't matter. It's the quality of the experience you're having that defines it. So there's these different notions of time that I think are becoming more relevant. And here's what the research I think shows. Think about time not like a point in space, but like a timeline. So instead of looking at life coming at you, like you're watching a TV and the clock is ticking, that's sort of a passive way to experience time. Think of yourself moving along a timeline. Think of life as time as this extended tree. And the touch points are the flags that you see. Those are the points at which you make a connection, the points at which you gain information. If you're thinking about a meeting you're having at work next Monday, and right now you're not meeting with them, so you're just thinking about how to present it and how to meet the client's needs, for instance. All that is happening on the path in between the touch points. And it's not until the touch point on Monday that you get new information and you connect to what's really going on for them. In between those points, I'd like to imagine that there's possibility. There's lots that's unformed and unknown. And even possibly some momentum. So some sense in which we're moving along a particular branch and it's going somewhere. The outcome of this branch is a touch point, a positive meeting with my client. If I'm doing the things I need to do along the way to bring that into reality. But I don't need to be worried at every single moment, am I doing everything just right? Because I've already got some momentum. I'm on a path towards the next touch point. Judy, do you want to jump in? Is there a question?
Yes, Carol wants to know, how about thinking of yourself as exterior to a timeline?
I'd like to know more about what they mean by that.
Yeah, Carol, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can say more about that. Are you willing to do that?
Or put it in the Q&A is fine too, whichever works.
Yeah, if you can, say a little more about that. Carol, I've unmuted you, or you can. If you unmute, you can say more about that, Carol.
Oh, she has no microphone. She said taking a viewpoint outside the timeline. Great.
Oh, I see.
Taking a viewpoint outside the timeline. Yeah, so it's good. We get to sort of figure out, what does this picture really even mean? My sense is that the timeline is defined by you being on it. So everyone has their own version of this timeline. And you're seeing it from your perspective, and somebody else's timeline is sort of, that's what you're looking at from the outside. But there's a sense of the relational nature that this is defined relative to you and your perspective. So it's subjective. So I'm not sure if I answered what you were intending, but we can come back to it if it's not. So thinking of yourself moving along a timeline, it's kind of like a fence. Think of this as the fence post model. Touch points are when we share information. And when I interact with you, we're sharing information, and that's like a fence post in the ground. And then the next fence post is the next time I share information. In between those fence posts is uncertainty, the unknown. And the suggestion is that we can allow some uncertainty in ourselves about what is happening, so that we don't hold on to what we hope is going to happen or what we think is already certain. We open up to what's possible. So if I was certain about what was happening when I called Dana from Spain, I would be pretty clear that we weren't going to meet. But because there's all this space in between the fence posts that's unknown and undetermined, well, there's a lot of ways it can unfold that I can't predict or plan for, like her getting an invitation to go to Paris and me getting sick and going to Paris. So this is an invitation really to just notice what you are observing that's true and everything else that you're making up in your mind about what's happening. Everything you're not observing is in your imagination. It becomes real. Like if you read the newspaper, whatever you read becomes part of your fixed reality. So that's a touch point with the world when you just read the news. But everything that before you read that news, everything that's possible is happening out there in your imagination. You're making up an imagination about what is happening, but the true story is actually not determined yet. And this is the key idea. This is taking quantum mechanics to a macroscopic level, which is a very controversial idea. I go to great lengths to argue this philosophy, or it's not a philosophy, to argue this point, but it's something that's quite difficult to navigate in the physics community, because we are so convinced that quantum mechanics is a particle by particle theory. And we're not going to go into today the frames of assumptions that go into that description. But the way that I see it is around wholeness, that there is a sense in which these quantum properties apply to the whole entity at once, not built up from the ground, which is exactly why I'm bringing up these notions of photographs, that you build them from patterns that extend as a whole, not piece by piece. If you build up quantum particles piece by piece, yes, they cancel. The quantum effects cancel, and the macroscopic properties don't have quantum mechanics. But I don't think that's how quantum mechanics really might work in the end. So the sense in which properties of things, whether they're macroscopic or microscopic, don't seem to actually exist until we observe them. Dana doesn't actually have a definite state until I observe her in Paris, and one particular branch falls into place. Both branches were possible. One becomes reality. So why do I think this is so? The fence post model is essentially saying this. In between the fence posts, what's true? It's actually not defined. It's not clear. There's many possibilities. So think of this as a virtual-like reality. The responsive cosmos is like a virtual reality. What makes a virtual reality is that in a virtual world, the histories of non-player characters, NPCs, are flexible to changing information. They're flexible to changing information. So if I'm Trinity and Neo walking through the building and I'm being chased by the agents, who are the bad guys, if I take a right down a hallway, I might bump into the agents because they took a right down that same hallway. So then we get in a gun battle, and I want to avoid that. So what if I go left down the hallway instead? Will I avoid them because they're on the right? Well, no, because they're NPCs. They're just bits on a computer. They're not real. So they can adjust. The Matrix, by the way, is a virtual world, in case you haven't seen the movie. Probably everybody here has. So the agents can be adjusted. Their history can be adjusted to match the choice that was actually made. This is the key idea, to have history adjust to match the choice that we make. It can only adjust for things that are not actually known to us yet. We can't have a conflict of observation. But the NPCs that we haven't observed, the non-player characters that aren't real, can be adjusted to match our choice. And there's ways that we model this in virtual reality. We realize it's a necessary feature of virtual reality. A virtual reality game, you don't have to understand this graph here. It's just showing you this is pretty cool. A virtual reality game is made of different people playing on their own computer across the world. So you're playing on your computer with another person playing on their computer, but there's a pretend virtual world that you're sharing. So how do you create a single, the appearance of a single virtual world from these two different places? Well, you share the personal experiences that you need to. Your computer is going to share with me when you come close to me so that I can know where you are when you come close to me. But if you're not close to me, there's no reason for me to know that. So I'm not going to be given that information. And so only the needed information is shared. And that creates the illusion of an objective single world. But actually, there's a lot in that world that's not defined. Like my computer doesn't have a lot of information about that your computer has because it's not relevant to me, even though it's part of the same game and the same virtual world. And so in this way, history can be flexible because there's so much that I don't have access to. And then after the fact, things fall into place in order to match the choices that are made. When I go down a hallway and it's clear that something needs to happen a certain way for the plot to move forward, then it can unfold in that way. It's because it's flexible. Now, what do I mean by flexible? Histories are flexible. Well, think of light leaving the sun. Light takes 8 minutes. And let's say every certain amount of distance, it sort of bounces across a piece of dust or something. So it branches into different possible paths. Now, these are possible paths. So it's not multiple rays of light. It's a single ray of light that's bouncing in possible directions. So this represents essentially the wave function in a way of the light, the different possibilities. Now you can see only one of these hits the earth. So if you're on Earth and you feel the sun on your skin, that's because one of those photons has reached your skin. So that means if it's reached your skin, the whole 8 minutes there becomes retroactively determined. If the light reached your skin, that means it must have traveled on this path. So this is a really important feature that's related to the delayed choice phenomenon identified by John Wheeler. For microscopic particles, this is not a controversial idea. It's the end point that determines the necessary path to get there. But this is really interesting when you think about time as a line versus just a point on the clock. When time is a line, then it's the end point of that line that determines what's necessary in order for the plot to unfold to get there. So synchronicity is when something shows up in your life that helps you get to that end point. But it's the end point, it's that touch point when you have that meeting, when things actually fall into place, that determines everything that needs to fall into place to get there. So the path of the light is determined by who sees it at the end. This is not foreign to us if you think about language, this notion of contextuality. Think about this phrase, the old train. What does that phrase make you think of? Probably something like this. A train sitting there being overgrown. And the phrase is, the old train left the station. But what if I change that phrase to be the old train, the young? The end of the sentence changes the meaning of the entire sentence. And changes the meaning of train and changes the meaning of old. So the old train, the young is more like our elders train our youth. So the old means the old person, and the train means not a physical train, but an action of training. And so the end determines the beginning. This is known as local ambiguity. So it's pretty amazing to think of this in a broader context of how the end can actually determine the whole path. And this is how I would describe the situation with me in Paris. It's the end point when I actually choose to go down that particular hallway at that particular museum in that particular city that makes it possible for Dana's whole path to fall into place in that same location. And up until that point, maybe there was also paths in which she goes to a different museum and we meet there, or goes to a bakery and we meet there. So there's all these different branches. Somebody was talking earlier about being outside a branch. That's what Dana's branch is outside of me, and there's all these different ways I can connect up with it. So let's pause and reflect for a moment. What choice am I not making that I wish I was? That's what we asked earlier. Oh, we didn't ask that. Sorry, I skipped that slide. So you can ask that for yourself. What is a choice that you're not making that you wish you were? Something that you wish you were doing more of, or saying yes to, opportunities you wish you were saying yes to. Maybe you wish you were exercising more. or wish you were having more time to reflect with friends and have a good time. And if you were to become more open to the idea of touch points, of what's actually possible in between touch points, what is a different choice you might make? In other words, if you could see that there's actually more possibilities available than you can realize, than you can picture, are there things you would tackle, new ideas or projects you would try, new relationships you would pursue that you wouldn't have tried otherwise? And what would it feel like to make that choice? Would it feel thrilling and exciting? Would it feel like a relief? It's just a chance to open up to more possibilities than you can currently imagine, and to live in that ambiguity and unknown. And so this is the question that I frame for myself. How do we make choices in a world which is not formed until the end point? I think maybe we would not be convinced by the stories our filters tell. So our filters tell us what's possible, but they're not necessarily true, because there's so much possible in between the endpoints, in between the touch points. And so we become less convinced by how we think things are going to unfold, and more open to the different opportunities that might emerge unexpectedly. So you can think of this strategically as a planning tool. What's the next fence post at your work? What's the next timeline or deadline? When's the next meeting you're going to have? Are you going to meet with someone at work tomorrow? Or maybe this. I have a friend who I'm meeting I met last night to have a conversation. He's also someone who can give me feedback on my physics work. So I spent yesterday taking some time to refine my latest draft so that when I met with him, I could share it with him. It gave me a fence post to work towards. So thinking about these fence posts as things to work towards, chances to get feedback. You might have these at home as well. My family's going away on vacation next week, and it's a fence post. It's a chance to think about how I want that experience to be, how to prepare for that, how to improve my relationship with my family, what I can do to prepare and make it a great experience. Once that fence post happens, everything I've done will lead me there, and everything I haven't done will just not be done. So these fence posts give us opportunities to leapfrog, to look at where our life is going. And the key idea here is that we can expect synchronicity. We define these fence posts. We define what's the next milestone. And the idea is that synchronicity is going to unfold in response to that. So because I chose to go to Paris, synchronicity unfolded, which allowed her to be in Paris as well. If I'm going on vacation on next week, that sets up an opportunity for me to receive information this week that helps me plan. Find an article about the place I'm going and a cool thing to do, and put that into my mind and start to plan around that. So I think we can expect synchronicity. We can't predict it, but we can plan around it. And finally, I want to connect this to flow. I think that synchronicity leads to flow, because when we align with circumstances, circumstances align with us. So the way that I think about flow is a little bit different from some of the popular notions. A lot of folks talk about flow as this optimization, sort of how I'm going to tackle my life wholeheartedly. But I also like to think of it as, how do I have fewer filters? How do I step out of the way of my filters so that I can see what's really happening around me? How do I move between the rooms of my house? What I mean by moving between the rooms of my house is when I was, at the hot tub, and I was in the state of expectation, and I had to shift from expectation of having a hot tub to the the disappointment of not being able to do that. That's moving from one frame of mind to a different frame of mind. And if I don't do that, I might feel frustrated and angry about the situation. But by being able to talk to myself a little bit and say, well, maybe there's other benefits here, or maybe I can let go of my attachment. It's about moving from where I thought I was going to be to where I actually am. And that's a tool that we can use to get into flow. And then I wanted to go back into my room and be quiet, and I got an invitation to go meet some new people. And again, that meant moving between the bedroom and the living room, right? The place where I'm going to go hole up, and the room in my house where I'm going to socialize. And that takes some practice, some skill to be able to shift my mindset from one set of expectations and feelings to another set. So I think it's useful to imagine moving between these different rooms as how we get into flow and how we stay in flow. When we're in flow, we're able to move between the rooms readily. And I'd like to maybe jump ahead here and take questions. We have about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, so Donna wants to know, Donna Lee, your model shows the importance of having goals, making plans, and setting intentions. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. And specifically, it's suggesting that there is a physical phenomenon which is responding to those goals, that's bringing you specific pieces of information or circumstances, which we call synchronicities, which facilitate those goals.
So that goes back to the idea of the responsive universe, the universe being responsive. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Paul's question about higher power or higher knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't see a distinction between the higher power and the human power. I think that there's a distinction when the human is living through a filter and the ego is involved, saying, what I think is necessary is this, and then somebody else suggests something different and I stay attached to my point of view. There's a certain way of being that is out of flow that in some sense might cause some conflict. I guess what I would say is there's a natural way in which, if you imagine all the possibilities as branches, there's a natural set of branches that would be the most beneficial for all involved. I think what's amazing about flow is it actually leads us to that way of being that serves everything. Because nature is this way, right? Everything is growing together, usually in harmony in some sense, in some symbiosis. And when we are in flow, we're also in symbiosis in that way. And so I think there's not a distinction between the self and the divine power that gives us synchronicity. It's a programming, like I use that word in the title, a programming which is going to bring us these events. And the more we can align with those events and see what it is we need to learn from them or how we can use them for the benefit of everything, that we can experience more flow and more gratification.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about filters, I'm thinking about, we have personal filters, but then I think we also have kind of institutional filters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like at an organization,
mm-hmm.
maybe on many levels, even now, sort of nationally. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking just in terms of polarization and the stories that we're telling ourselves about who we are as a country, as a world. So I'm thinking about individually, we have a lot of say if we look at our own filters, right? And say, okay, we're aware of this. How do you propose that we do that on a mass basis? Do you think it's possible?
I do think it's possible. I think that it starts, a requirement for that is that people have an understanding of their own participation in those filters. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's useful to have a model. And there are lots of good models, psychological models that describe filters that I'm not an expert on psychology or on my own filter. I'm pretty good at my own filters. I'm getting better, but not on other people's, right? So my knowledge is really subjective of the situation. But I think when we do have theories that are applicable and that we resonate with, that we see as useful, and that's why I think it's useful to have physics underlying this. If it's true, it needs to be understood, because then it's a sense in which we collectively can say, oh yeah, this is the way these things operate. I would like to know more about it. And then the curiosity can be born. Mm-hmm. So and that's what's the important thing about science, is that it's replicable. And because it's replicable, it brings us into a communal agreement about what's real. Of course, that's not always the case, as we know with polarization right now, but that's how it should work. And so that universality that comes with scientific research allows us to form different frameworks. So if we can understand time differently, if we can understand time as a timeline, if indeed that is the case, which I've tried to show in my recent paper, space-time paths as a whole, then it's important that we look at the world that way. It's important that we see what are the consequences of life, of time being this momentum, or this path of like Kairos time versus, like there's some validity to Kairos time versus Chronos time. And the first thing it elicits is curiosity of what else can I, is there something I don't know here that will help me understand my life better? And I think when we do that, we also experience personal benefits, like our lives become more harmonious within our personal relationships, the more we understand the world as our world as it really is. So I think as we practice seeing that our filters are getting in the way of understanding, we actually experience benefits which reinforce that learning. I think to answer the question about the collective, I think there's certain qualities like compassion that are really important. So that we understand, if we understand, we don't have to agree with someone's perspective, but if we understand that our perspective is based on filters and their perspective is based on filters, we just have a common understanding that filters do exist, then we can start having more openness to each other's perspectives.
Let me see if there's Carol. Back to taking a viewpoint outside of the timeline. I see this as related to Spinoza's subspecies Asternitatis, under the aspect of eternity versus worldly, the classical distinction between spiritual versus worldly, stepping out of the world as pure consciousness, spiritual consciousness, allows the will of God, however you want to define God, to have its way. Lots of flow and spiritual substance as emanation of God. In contemporary metaphysics, this is akin to operating from 5D, 7D, or 9D plus, and being in the spiritual flow, which influences what shows up in life. I'm reminded also of Sai Baba and various manifestations, literally to make from the hand of gesture of his hand, and being the flow of spiritual consciousness and substance allows for these manifestations. And she makes a good point about these esoteric traditions. I mean, a lot of what you're saying is in physics comes from these perennial wisdom, or they align so well. I was thinking of timelines, and I was thinking that's very shamanic. It's very shamanic thinking. And this could really help us, as a collective, maybe shift our mindset.
I think that's true. And that's why it's so interesting to me. And it's so important that we do this research scientifically, in addition to the other ways that it can be done. But I think there's a value when more people who are really, really keen on left brain thinking can say, okay, but there is a way that there's an assumption I'm making about time that's wrong. And that allows for more openness to other possibilities. I think, the more we can see, the more we can see that our way of viewing is actually limited. It opens us up to humility, that there are other perspectives. And there are lots of people's perspectives that I just cannot agree with. But I do understand that there's reasons I cannot agree with them, and it's not their fault. It's actually me that's not able to see their perspective.
Yeah, I was noticing you used the word harmony a couple of times. And I was thinking of that in terms of, of all of this moving toward more harmony. This really seems like a scientifically based, but spiritually grounded way to move toward more harmony personally, and then even collectively.
And it is hard to define, what's something we can all agree upon, a goal that we can all agree upon. I don't think harmony is a scientifically defined term, really, because it does mean sort of a sense in which we all benefit from each other's existence, but it doesn't define what that means. Different people benefit from different things. So I think that there's a humanness to it that's left open, which is good, at least at this point. But it does, I think that phrase has enough collective agreement on just what we mean by it. It's loose enough to mean enough things to different people. Kind of like the word wholeness is a loose word. I didn't define it as one thing, but as many different things. So we can all have different ways into it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So I'm going to if there's any more questions, I'm looking at the time. We are right at 1:30.
I did. There was other things that could be said about that last question. So until someone else speaks up, I'll speak a little bit more.
Yeah,
I think that there is not a surprise that the spiritual traditions that I'm aware of, and even the ones that I'm learning about after the fact, are in alignment with these, because I didn't come up with these ideas either. These are coming from traditional wisdom, coming from physics, modern physics, and seeing the connection, because there's probably a connection if both groups of all these different groups of people are seeing reality in different ways. It's just like that wholeness, right? We're trying to get to the whole picture of reality, and physics is one way we can touch the elephant, and Spinoza is another way we can touch the elephant, philosophy. Mm-hmm. And religions are another way we can touch the elephant. And each of these different ways to touch the elephant has problems with it. There are things about science and things about religion that don't work well, but that doesn't mean that they're not valid and that there's not smart, intelligent, compassionate people doing in each of these groups doing the work. So I think it's it's very important for all of us to have respect for all these different perspectives that have existed for so many thousands of years that have validity.
Absolutely.
Jerry says harmony can mean balance and ways to achieve balance.
Yeah. I like that definition.
Yeah. Balance is such a great word too, because it itself is dynamic. And if you apply balance to itself, there's a sense of sometimes it's being balanced is not to have balance. Like there are times when I've had to finish my master's thesis, and the thing to do was to work nonstop for a week. Mm-hmm. And I've had to let go of the principle of having balance in my life. But there was another form of balance in that. It's not that it's not balanced.
That's right, contributing to sort of a larger, zoomed out balance.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that is all I have.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming today.
Thank you. Tell us how we can follow you and your webpage.
So I'm at synchronicityinstitute.com, and I have the book Leap to Wholeness book that just came out.com. And there's a great intro video on that site that you can watch. We have a mobile app that will hopefully be coming out pretty soon called Sync Track, which allows you to track and identify these connections between the events of your life. I have a course that I launched in the last couple of years called the Living in Flow course, a self-paced online course, which you can check out at livinginflowcourse.com, also on the website below. And the paper, if you want to read it or read summary of it, is called Space-Time Paths as a Whole in Quantum Reports. And also check out my YouTube channel, Sky Nelson. Have a lot of cool content up there.
That's awesome. I love the idea of a mobile app for tracking synchronicities. That's wonderful. Really, to bring it back, to remind yourself to look for them.
Yeah, to look for them and to see. Sometimes you don't notice what the clue is until later. So you say, well, this is a strange thing that happened to me. Why did I end up late at the BART station, at the train station, and end up missing my train? I might note that down in the app, and then later on I realized it's really good because that track was delayed, and I ended up getting on to my place on time, and so I can follow up with a second event and link those two together and start to see the thread that thread that Steve Jobs was talking about, connecting the dots.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks everyone.
Have a great rest of your day.
Have a great day.
Bye.